Good evening and welcome to today's session of Emergence Global, our second session actually. Again, I'm Hugo DuPont and I'll be your host for today's session. For this evening's session, we are delighted to welcome Owen Thompson from Cambridge Future Tech and Jem Davis from My Voice AI. The two of them are going to deliver a cracking fireside chat on the UK deep tech landscape. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the both of them.
There you go. All right, so I'm Owen Thompson, a previous fighter pilot and then GM of the Advanced Technology Solutions Division at BAE Systems. And I'm here today with Jem Davies, who is the ex-VP Fellow and GM of many different groups at Arm, but most recently the Machine Learning Group. Jem, could you tell us a bit about your background and everything that led to that point?
Sure. I'm only a glider pilot. I haven't flown anything past about 200 knots. I worked most recently for about 18 years at Arm, primarily on the technical side. I was a fellow, but ended up becoming general manager of first the media processing group and then founder member of the machine learning group. And both of those really were startups inside Arm. And anyone who tells you that doing a startup inside a large company is easy has just obviously never done it. It's just as hard as doing startups outside. And that's where my heart lies. So since leaving Arm, I've been helping and advising and becoming various board positions of a number of startups.
Fantastic. And Jem, given your background and career within the semiconductor industry in particular and at Arm, what do you see, and I'm going to delve straight into deep tech here, what do you see as the biggest challenges in the space, and what do you think the future of deep tech evolutions will be?
I mean, I think some of the deep tech evolutions are just going to be simply fantastic. We're getting to really mind-blowing science fiction style innovations. But there's a mismatch between people's expectations of how long this stuff takes and how much it costs to develop. There is at Arm, now a very steady state business of us Arm designing IP and then selling it, and people building chips and sending Arm royalty checks. But most investors don't understand that pipeline, how long it takes to develop something before you can sell it, and then how long it takes at the customer before they make chips and send the royalty checks back. And that's a really established business. So looking at a deep tech startup, I think we have a real mismatch between how long people think this stuff takes to develop, and anything like anything involved in silicon just takes a very long time. And so people who are investing in this bit space have to be in it for the long haul.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about patient capital and about the evolution of the investment sector alongside the technology sector evolving into the new wave of innovation in deep tech.
Yeah.
Great points. And I suppose AI is one of the biggest trends at the moment. What most excites you about the future of AI?
So I'll first of all take exception. I really don't like the term AI. I think we're no closer to artificial intelligence now than we were 30 years ago. But machine learning is huge. Machine learning and the application of new techniques like neural networks, but not exclusively those, is really paying huge dividends. And anytime you've got a problem with a large amount of data and decisions to be made on that data or learning to be made from that data, then these techniques are proving to be incredibly effective. If anything, it's over delivering on its promise. Initially, people were saying, oh, well, you had to do all these classical numerical processing techniques first and then give it to the ML, and then you get wonderful things out of it. None of that proved to be true. Just apply the ML techniques from the raw data, and we just get fantastic results out of it.
Yeah, interesting. And where do you think that will end up if you extend that forward 5 years?
Well, I think almost any big data plane problem is still ripe for exploitation with these techniques. We had a game where you would just type in a random sort of scientific process and add machine learning to it, and just type that into Google, and somebody would have written a paper that said, oh, we've just tried applying ML techniques to this thing that nobody said could be done, and lo and behold, we got great results. So I think it's one of those truly fundamental building blocks of technology that you can't see where it's going. And that's really exciting. It's actually very much like ARM. At ARM, they made components which you give to other partners who then go off and have clever ideas. And some of them amaze you, and some of them go, do you know what? I just would never have thought of that. And I think ML's like that. It's a fundamental component technology that we haven't seen the end of yet.
So with that though, with that case study that you cite there, adding in an ML layer, and particularly the recent iterations of generative AI APIs and things like this, how
Yeah.
do you go about diligencing something like that? And I know you've done quite a bit of diligencing on the back of M&A propositions in the past, but where do you start?
Well, I always go back to the Gartner hype cycle. And just because something is being massively overhyped doesn't mean that there isn't something real underneath. So a lot of hype around ChatGPT and those generative AI models, and people saying this is true artificial intelligence. And of course, it's absolutely nothing of the sort. But if we look at ChatGPT, is there a tool under that that actually makes writing human script easier and better? Yes. Are most engineers really bad writers? Yes. Taking their output and putting it through ChatGPT generates things that are much more readable and legible. So I think again, I don't believe it's artificial intelligence, certainly not artificial general intelligence. I think it's deeply flawed in many ways. It can be misled, et cetera, et cetera. But is there a tool under there that's going to get tremendously well used? Yes, I absolutely think so.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm going to change the subject matter a little bit now onto something, I guess, a bit more controversial. And this is a hot topic in the UK right now, and we've seen a lot. I hear several times a day that I recently read the article in the Financial Times. What are your views on this? And we generally refuse to take a position publicly. But how do you think the university ecosystem in the UK plays into the deep tech landscape with the current hot topic discussions that are going on?
Well, let's start with a few things that people would not find controversial. University funding in the UK is utterly and completely broken. I don't think anyone can argue with that one. So actually, you've then got the university saying, well, okay, we're not being paid enough money to do what we're being asked to do. How are we going to grub around for money? And I think that one of the things they've been forced to do, in particular with spin-outs, is to be very aggressive in terms of the ownership rights of those spin-outs. And fair play to them, they've got a job to do, but it's just not realistic. I mean, Einstein's inspiration perspiration thing. I mean, an invention is not a business. Taking that invention and then actually turning that into a product, creating a brand new business around that product is a huge amount of work, and it's a huge amount of the value. And so university expectations of the proportion of the value of that company that they can take for the invention that goes into it is just not reasonable in many cases. And I won't name names, but there are certain universities that are just too hard to work with. There are certain tech transfer offices that I simply wouldn't bother working with because it's just too hard. Their expectations of value are excessive, and they are holding back innovation, and they are holding back the creation of those businesses because it's too hard to get investment. Because investment partners say, you know what, I'll go elsewhere. I'll go to that university instead of that one.
Yeah. And we see that also. Do you think there's any argument that the same can be said on the VC side, and that there's an equally aggressive argument for the VCs coming in and wanting to maximize their opportunity in that early stage space?
Forgive me, I don't expect any better of VCs. I do expect better from supposedly well-educated academics. And VCs will do what the market, effectively, VCs will do what the market encourages them to do. And if VCs can buy into something very cheaply, then they will do so. But of course, successful VCs in a particular area, like deep tech, have had to learn that it takes a while before they get their money back, and that they have to be more reasonable in terms of their expectations.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we've seen it's done slightly differently over, of course, in the US. That's maybe a slightly more mature tech transfer office ecosystem,
Yeah.
or perhaps, it's arguably it's more effective, or arguably it's not. What's your view on or do you have much experience of how that looks different in the US compared to the UK?
I have a little experience. I've not tried to actually negotiate with a tech transfer office in the US, but I think there's been a longer time period of experience of these tech transfer offices. You look at Stanford, Berkeley, places like that. They've been doing this for 40 years, and they're just more experienced at it. Some of the newer universities in this country, it just haven't been doing it for that long, and just it takes time, and you have to educate them about what's realistic.
Yeah, fair point. And I'm really interested then, still sort of on the university topic. We deal with a lot of academic founders that are coming out of the research environment, and they're wanting to see some commercial traction on their innovations. And one of the big challenges is communicating that out to a wider audience. And I think this is probably something that you've got a very acute experience of, and perhaps you sit on a bridge between two different areas. How do you approach the challenge of communicating complex deep tech concepts to a broader audience, and what strategies have you found to be the most effective? Because I'll just cite the single page ARM business model diagram, which is a work of art from a while back. How do you get to that stage where that's so effective to communicate, and what are the strategies?
Well, of course, it takes time, and you see that single pager, which is, as you say, a glorious work of art. That didn't appear overnight. A lot of people's blood, sweat, and tears went into that in progressively reducing an idea. And ARM has a guy whose job it is to take complex technical messages and reduce it to its absolute simplest form to take to investors, to the street and to the city. And I've been on the other end of it, and I've sent him slide decks, and he just goes, "No, I can't use any of that. Have another go." And he's been back and forth 3 times before I've reduced it to a level of simplicity that it gets that message across. And I think that discipline is incredibly useful for all of us. What I've been doing with deeply technical founders is to try to get them to take the next step. So they're going, "Look at my shiny, shiny invention. This is very, very clever. I'm very, very proud of this invention." And he's like, "Yes, you should be." But there are really only 5 people in the world who understand how clever that is. And it's not a product. Yes, it is. It's glorious. Look how clever it is. No, that's not a product. A product is something that solves a problem that somebody has who's willing to pay you money to make that problem go away. And so you actually have to get the academics in particular to understand that next leap. So, okay, this is your thing that you've invented. It's very clever. What does it do? What's it for? What's it good for? Why does anyone care? Oh, well, with this highly clever invention, I enable this thing to happen better, faster, cheaper, or even at all. That's a product. That's a thing that most people can get their heads around. So you just have to get them to go that extra step in explaining the leap between what it is they've done and what it enables that a man in the street, or a man with a checkbook, for those people who are old enough to remember that, why they would care. Oh, you mean I can now do X? Yes. Oh, wow. Yeah. Where do I sign? And actually, it doesn't take much. And often these are incredibly clever people. They learn very quickly. Nobody's ever taken the time to explain to them the difference between an invention and a product. And as soon as you get that across to them, they usually get it. Just takes a little work.
Yeah, of course. And I think we often see the feedback to founders from their pitches that they need to isolate the killer application.
Yes.
I think that sometimes starts with identifying the problem, and then really being able to communicate at scale why this matters.
Yeah. So often feedback you'll get is, what is the killer application? And often I think that's code for, I have no idea what this is any good for. but actually, people are quite polite in their feedback, and they don't want to say, I have no idea what you just said or what it is. They want to say something like, can you give us more information on product market fit?
Yeah.
And that's code for, who wants to pay large amounts of money for this thing and why? and actually just take it to basics. Yeah. Where is the problem that this thing solves? Who has the problem? Do lots of people have the problem? Do lots of people have the problem who have lots of money who would pay you lots of money to have the problem solved? And, that's product market fit.
Yeah, and one of the things, I mean, do you think that's particularly acute in deep tech? I guess with the old B2B SaaS applications and more web-based software platforms and things like that, that's sometimes easier to communicate.
Yes. I mean, I saw a great description of what deep tech is, and it's, there's actually some technology here that might not work. So as opposed to an ordinary business where basically you're taking things that work and trying to make a business out of them, here we are trying to take things that may or may not actually work, make them work, and then make a business out of it. And so actually a lot of the founders' energy and focus goes into making it work. And they think, right, I've made it work. My job must be done. People will now form an orderly queue at the door with suitcases full of money. And sometimes they're a bit disappointed when that doesn't happen. And you have to say, brilliant, well done. You've done the first job. Now there's another one.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. So, I mean, what you've come on to there beautifully onto my next question is highlighting the risk involved in deep tech. And we often talk at Cambridge Future Tech about going in at a super high risk period, pre-incorporation or pre-idea, and then through a massive venture building process, de-risking and mitigating those risks and presenting something much less risky at the pre-seed stage. But I guess the crux is, how do you balance the need for innovation with the potential risks associated with new technologies? And what steps can you take to ensure responsible innovation in deep tech?
Well, you're an ex-fighter pilot, and I teach people to fly in planes with no engines. So some people would say neither of us are qualified to judge on risks. But I think the thing about risks is that actually people are frightened of risks. They're frightened of analyzing risks. They're frightened of actually sitting down and talking about risks. Oh, we don't want to talk about that, it might come true. Whereas actually the reverse is true for me. I'd much rather talk about, the risk of crashing, the risk of things coming true. And when you set out worst case analyses for these things, often you find, oh, well, that's actually not as bad as you feared. And the risk of that, well, yeah, that could happen. But, we could ameliorate it by doing this. And often a very frank analysis of risks and, as I say, ameliorating actions, I think is the way forward for this. And risks is one of those funny things. It's very, it's like an irregular verb. I think I take sensible steps. He's a madman. It's all personal, and different people have different risk appetites. But I think you can by taking people with experience, particularly of having done startups, people who have made a few mistakes that didn't kill them, bring that experience to bear onto the subject. Because particularly, I think, in deep tech startups, a lot of the people who are doing it have never done it before. They're not like serial entrepreneurs in new business models of grocery delivery, that all of whom have probably done something before. I think in deep tech, we get an awful lot of people who have spent the last 10 years researching and inventing this piece of technology. There's no way they're serial entrepreneurs. And one of the risk mitigations is to bring in people with some experience of startups and having seen some of the ways things can go wrong, who can sit politely by their shoulders and say, well, it might work that way, but I've done that twice and it didn't work either time for me. So have you considered doing it this way? And I think you can reduce a lot of the risks that way. And it's about acknowledging different skill sets, different experience. By now I know what I'm good at. Much more importantly, I know what I'm not good at. And, I surround myself with people who fill in those skills holes. A lot of initial tech founders just don't quite have that experience yet to know that actually what I need is a really good marketing guy, or I need a really good operations person. and just filling in those skills gaps.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I often say to people that I think to get involved in the really early stages of deep tech, you need an almost unlimited appetite for risk. But that's not actually true. It's all about calculated risk. And what you've outlined there is a process that I've found that adopting it's really helped us to understand where the risks lie. And it's a little bit dry, but keeping a risk register, and you mentioned acknowledging that there are risks and writing them down and then mitigating them and putting measures in place like advisors or external consultants or bringing different types of skill sets into what you're doing in order to mitigate those risks and reduce them seems to be the most appropriate way forward in order to present something that's much lower risk at the end.
At Arm, we had a sort of a two-way matrix of heat maps. So you looked at the likelihood of the risk, but also the consequence of the risk. And obviously, the bad ones are very likely and very bad. But it turns out actually there aren't many of those. Most of the very likely risks aren't in fact going to kill you, and most of the things that will kill you aren't very likely. And when you look at a sensible sort of layout of those risks, this looks all right. I can do this.
Yeah, acknowledging those risks, being open about them, and then there are no surprises if something does go wrong.
Yeah.
And so I guess having been through all those risk mitigations and seen some substantial levels of success, I would love to ask you, Jem, over your career, what's been the biggest deep tech innovation that you've witnessed?
Well, it's a sort of a combination of semiconductors and miniaturization. My first job I did after graduation was in fact working with the NAG library that I'm now the chairman of NAG, but on a mainframe. Remember those? And we did something that later came to be called computational fluid dynamics. And eventually we had to send this program off to Rolls-Royce in Derby. And it transpired the only method of communication we had in common was punched cards. Now, and that was bizarre and antiquated and baroque even then. But we literally sent hired a van, and got couriered up probably half a ton of punch cards.
Fantastic.
And yet I moved from there to, in the same company, working with this startup over the other side of Cambridge called Acorn, who had these ideas about putting computers inside every home and every school. And this was radical, groundbreaking stuff. And now at the end of it, we have at Arm designed microprocessors so small and so cheap, they get used effectively because they're cheaper than switches. So a Dyson vacuum cleaner has an instantaneous make power switch, which is low voltage, so it's cheap, doesn't have to take high current, and it's cheap to manufacture because you don't have to make latching springs and all that sort of thing. And it just sends a pulse to a microprocessor that then controls a power transistor which switches on motor. And it's cheaper and more reliable to build that than it is to build a clunky click on off main switch. Brilliant. And that story is the embodiment of the miniaturization and the commoditization of semiconductors. And if we look at some of the really wild and wacky other deep tech innovations that are happening, they're almost every single one of them will in fact be tied with semiconductors to exploit this new technology. So if we look at even a whole bunch of what used to be called wet science innovations, they're being tied to semiconductors in order to exploit them, in order to make them usable and approachable and mass market. And so, my career aligned with the semiconductor industry career has just been extraordinary. I mean, the transformation is nothing short of miraculous.
That's incredible. I hope we see the same generational change again over the coming decades. I think
absolutely certain of it. Absolutely certain of it. And a number of people are doom and gloom mongering of, semiconductors are over, there's no scope for innovation and blah, blah, blah. I don't believe a single word of it.
Well, I suppose on that topic, and I think we've got time for just one last question, specifically with Edge AI,
Mhm.
What role do you see, and I suppose this is an emerging area within semiconductor, what role do you see Edge AI playing in the development of emerging technologies such as autonomous vehicles or smart cities and healthcare?
I think it's as close to a slam dunk as we get in tech, because the three laws, the laws of physics, the laws of economics, and in many places, the laws of the land, mean that you're going to want to do that AI processing as close as possible to the edge for a whole bunch of reasons involving data and power and security. And so we have at our availability now a whole range of new sensor technologies which create vast amounts of data, most of which is totally meaningless, and we're trying to extract meaning and correlated meaning out of this vast data mass, and that's machine learning. That's Edge AI is going to do that, and you're going to harness that alongside these other new technologies. I love the artificial nose that people are creating to be able to smell and recognize smells and use them for example, advanced diagnostics. Let's face it, if you can teach a dog to sniff out cancer, and we have proof that you can, why can't we do that with an artificial smell sensor? Well, answer, it turns out we can. Absolutely, we can. And we can sniff out all sorts of other things as well. But it takes an enormous amount of processing to be able to extract that information. So the application of this technique of machine learning to these new technologies has a sort of combinatorial explosion of possibilities. And I think it's hugely exciting. Hugely exciting. We've got so much more left to do.
Yeah, that is great fun, and there's so much more to come in the coming years. I think it's going to be a fantastic experience. On that note, Jem, as always, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today, and thank you for your time. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope that everyone else has as well.
Thank you for indulging me in my ramblings. I certainly hope to carry on doing more of these things in startups, particularly in the Cambridge area, which is just a fantastic place.
Brilliant. Always a pleasure. Thank you, Jem.
Thank you, Owen.